Hello, welcome to another edition of Empathy at the Table. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome Mark Raffan. Mark is an author, he's a revered authority on negotiation, and he's also the host of Negotiations Ninja, which is one of the top podcasts on negotiations in the world. Mark's a straight talker. He's into sales, procurement. He run his own business, run sales teams all over the world. And it gives me great pleasure to really do a deep dive and a delve into what negotiation means to somebody like Mark Raffan. Join me in welcoming Mark to Empathy at the Table. Mark Raffan, thank you very much for joining us today on Empathy at the Table. It kind of feels a bit weird because I've spent the last few years just listening to your voice. You've got a very distinctive voice, and it sounds a bit weird, like me now talking to you and listening to you on the other side. But for people who haven't heard of you, could you just give us a couple of words as to who you are and what your interest in negotiations are?
It feels right, though, doesn't it? It feels right that we should have this conversation so that we can expand the amount of people talking about negotiation as much as humanly possible. So I'm glad that you're
Absolutely.
doing this. What is my interest in negotiation? Primarily world domination. That is the major thing that I want to achieve. I want to completely subdue my enemies and take over the world. No, of course not. I appreciate I
I had my
appreciate that.
finger hovering over off.
No, negotiation for me has always been a lifelong love. I grew up in a family where conflict wasn't avoided. And it sounds bad when I say it out loud like that. Not in any bad sense of the word. It's just that if someone has an issue, they've always been open to expressing that issue. And so resolution of conflict and handling conflict has never been an issue because I've grown up and around it in my family. What was more difficult for me actually going into the professional world was learning how to tone down conflict and learning how to manage it and learning how to say things differently. And that sort of led me into a career that was suited towards that. So I started my career out in sales, then went into procurement, led a long career in procurement, and then eventually decided I didn't want to do that anymore. I wanted to pursue something on my own. And so that was sort of the birth of the Negotiations Ninja podcast, which eventually turned into a training company. And now that training company delivers negotiation training to some of the largest organizations in the world. And we work with procurement teams, sales teams, project management teams, leadership groups to help them to negotiate better deals so they can get more value and to resolve conflict primarily. Obviously, there's some persuasive speaking and all that kind of stuff mixed in there too, but the two main areas that we focus on are negotiation and conflict resolution. And I love it. I'm very fortunate in that I get to do what I love every single day, and I get to help people to drive more value in their lives, which is pretty cool. Not to mention the pursuit of world domination, which is also a fantastic side hustle that I have going on.
Side hustle.
Yeah.
I should tell listeners, please check out Mark's podcast. Single-handedly, I think, Mark, you've made negotiation sexy just by the name of the podcast. That's what attracted me to it. That was really cool.
Thanks. Yeah, I appreciate that. It's a cool name.
Yeah, it really is. And so, look, nobody is really born to teach negotiation, right? It's not, I remember at school, it wasn't like on the curriculum that, okay, this is a career path for somebody, to teach negotiation. What do you think are some of the things, some of the catalysts that push people into this area, this game where, they actually want to teach? What, apart from world domination, what are the motivations or some of the catalysts, do you think?
Yeah, I think frustration. For me, it was frustration. For me, it was anger and frustration that led me to want to do this because I noticed that it wasn't being done well, and I was frustrated. I was frustrated with the lack of information, the lack of content, the lack of good instruction, and so I felt that even the instruction that was out there that was good was too theoretical. It was too academic. There needed to be something that was more practical, more hands-on, and more applicable to day-to-day life. And so
Hmm.
that's what drove me to do it. I think for many people, they feel sort of the same way, as the frustration of like, I'm pretty sure I could teach people how to do this better than the way it's being done. Now, the benefit of sort of doing that is that now there's an abundance of great negotiation instructors and great negotiation content. I mean, when we think about what you're doing and what Kwame's doing and what a few other people are doing, like Kelt Jensen and a few others, like phenomenal. It's phenomenal. And look, we all have the idea of wanting to expand and evangelize great negotiation training. And there are some things that sure we might disagree on, but overall I think it's great that there's all these people that are promoting great negotiation skills, and I love it. I feel very blessed that
Hmm.
there's so much now available to people, which is amazing.
Yeah. And so, when we in a dream world, right, when you imagine people really with great negotiation skills and they're confident in the way they negotiate, kind of what do you imagine that the world looks like? Because, Mark Ruffin and people like yourself and myself have kind of passed through here. What does that actually look like?
Oh, I would love for people to not be afraid to have the conversation. I
Yeah.
think that would be my dream. I
Hmm.
think a lot could be solved in not only in the business world, but in the world of international diplomacy and even family conflict and negotiation,
Yeah.
if people just had the, you don't have to have it perfectly, right? Like just to have a conversation, like I have something that I want to resolve, I have something that I need from you, you have something that you, let's have a discussion about it. That would be my dream, where people just weren't afraid, or even if they were afraid, to act in spite of the fear would be my dream. I would much rather people have the conversation than resort to other means that they
Hmm.
think might resolve the negotiation. Was it Kennedy that said we must never be afraid to negotiate, but never fear to negotiate? I think it was something along those lines. And he was negotiating some peace treaties at the time, and that for me is really really important. We see that today. There's so much conflict,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, regardless of the big ones that we see on the news. There's also conflict that happens in families and between businesses and all those other kinds of things. And there's value that's being left on the table in negotiations aside from the conflict side of things, because people just won't have the conversation. So, yeah, that would be my dream. I would
Yeah.
love for that to happen.
I heard a podcast that you did, or an interview where you were talking about, in your trainings, people come to you and they say, well, I want to get better at sales. And they think they want to get better at sales. But actually, the big problem is selling what, and what's the value in that,
Right.
in getting better at sales. So when you have these conversations, right, and typically companies, when they say they want training in negotiation, it's to sell more, right? You and I know that that's just a byproduct. If you do everything the right way, then naturally you'll build better relationships, and naturally you'll be able to sell more anyway. So how do you open the conversation when it comes to talking to people who come up to you and all they want to do is just learn to sell better?
First of all, I say wonderful, right? Like, congratulations. I want you to learn to sell better too. That's great. I'm glad that you have a goal to improve, and I'm glad that you have a goal to get better. So usually the conversation goes like, well, I want to learn how to sell more. I want to learn how to make more money. I want to learn how to increase my margins. I want to learn how to reduce risk. Those are sort of the major themes that people have when we first start the conversation. And then it comes down to talking about, well, how have you done that in the past? Like, what is your plan going forward? And then we get into the conversation of like, well, I had this prospecting training. Fantastic. What did that generate? It generated some results. Great. Oh, I had this additional discovery training. Wonderful. What did that generate? And we talk about the results of that. And then we get into the fact of like, okay, if you've done the prospecting training and you've filled the pipeline, that's great. That's going to be like 90+% of getting you the way there. But the problem is that even if you fill the pipeline, you may concede on so much value in the pipeline or not be able to move people forward in that pipeline to the final stages of contract completion that you end up destroying all of the hard work that you've
Yeah.
completed in filling that pipeline. So I appreciate and I love folks that teach pipeline development and prospecting and all of those kinds of things. Think about like John Barrows, think about Justin Michael, think about all these guys that talk about driving pipeline development. But once you have that pipeline and you're moving people through those stages, it comes down to how persuasive you're being, how valuable the conversation is to them, and how much you're going to be able to negotiate them into a deal. And so for a lot of people, I say, okay, now that you've got those sales skills down, or you're working on developing those sales skills in parallel, let's work on your negotiation skills because that's going to help you to capture the value that you've already put into the pipeline and maintain and retain that value over time. Because we see massive erosion of value as deals go through that pipeline because people aren't able to negotiate those deals forward.
And I guess also along the value chain, you don't want to just pass value down the value chain. At certain points, you want to be able to create more value. And that requires negotiation, right? Otherwise, you're just an order taker, just kicking the can further down the road.
Yeah, and I think one of the major things that we struggle with, especially I work with a lot of tech sales folks. A lot of tech sales folks struggle with being very transactional because you're selling a SaaS product and you don't necessarily think of all of the value that can be added to that deal. You're thinking about the completion of that deal.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so you're rewarded to a large extent for closing fast because they want speed to ROI
yeah.
or speed to value. And my whole thesis is based on like, yes, speed is important. We want to get you there faster, but not at the cost of losing the value in the deal, right? You can get a $10,000 really quickly, or $100,000 deal an extra 30 days. Which would you prefer? Right? So if you're willing to spend an extra 30 days to get 10x the value that you would usually get, it's worth it to learn some negotiation skills.
Yeah. You're based in Calgary, right?
I am. Although
Yeah.
if you ask my wife, she would say I'm based on a plane.
Oh, right. So do you do much stuff in Europe?
Nothing in Europe. I do a
Okay.
little bit here and there, but like virtually nothing.
Right. Because I want to know whether what you think in terms of the cultural differences in the way we negotiate.
Huge
Have
cultural
you?
differences, in my opinion.
Yeah, yeah. Can you share
Strategy
some of
doesn't
your insights?
change, but the application of the strategy changes based on the cultural nuance that exists in that country. So, like, typically, big generalization that I'm about to make, typically, and you'll see this especially in body language and tone of voice and those kinds of things, typically highly expressive nations like Italians, some Spanish, um, South America, Central America, versus low expression countries like the UK, like some Slavic nations. There's a big difference in how they apply their tactics, and that can be misconstrued by either side of the table as either rude or intrusive or maybe too withheld or too withdrawn, maybe too cold. So it depends on who you're negotiating with and how they generally negotiate. But it's most common, in our opinion, it's most commonly seen through body language, tone of voice, and the way that they
Interesting.
apply the strategy that way.
So this is something I picked up a few years ago. I think I did a Berkeley course on negotiation, and one of the professors said this, and I haven't really researched it, so I'm throwing this out to you cold. I'd like to know what you think. But
Sure.
he said that oftentimes you find there's a correlation between the government of a country and the way the people negotiate. So if you have like a government where the people tend to have low trust in the government, they tend to negotiate in a way where obviously they don't trust people, so they hold the information close to their heart, and they won't share so much. Whereas if you have a nation where people have much more confidence in the government, that also percolates into the way they negotiate. Now, I don't have any data on this at all, but I just throw it out there. How does it actually sound as a concept?
It's the first time I've heard of that, but that does sound right. Right? Like if you think of Nordic countries, Denmark,
Yeah,
Sweden, Norway, they generally are more open and transparent, and I would
yeah,
suggest that they probably have more trust. At least, this is, by the way, I have no data to back this up.
yeah,
I'm just
yeah, yeah,
making a statement from what I've observed.
yeah.
From what I've observed, they generally trust their governments more. Um, yeah, that's interesting. And in China, the opposite is true,
Yeah,
which is also interesting, right? They play their cards pretty close to their chest.
exactly.
There is a lot of withholding of information until the time is right, until I know I can actually give you that information. So, yeah, that is interesting. I've never heard that before, but yeah, it seems to check out.
Yeah, yeah. I'm going to do some research into it, but I thought I'd throw it out there. When you listen to just this conversation, you can understand why people just don't want to negotiate, because it just sounds like a nebulous ball of confusion and smokes and mirrors and daggers
Can
and all
be.
this kind of stuff. Yeah, yeah. And so it's people like us that are on a crusade to democratize negotiation and let
I like
people
that
know,
word,
right?
crusade.
On the right side of negotiation, there are creative, great conversations and value adds. One statement that you made, and I'd like to unpack it a bit, Mark. You said that you don't have to make a deal in a negotiation. You were against a lot of these people who talk about negotiation is all about making deals, and I think you're quite strong about that. Do you want to unpack that for us?
Yeah, just because you haven't made a deal doesn't mean you haven't negotiated, and it also doesn't mean that there hasn't been value to the negotiation. So, yeah, and you were right. I am very opinionated about this, and maybe to the point where it gets a bit misconstrued in how I say things, because I say things in a fairly hyperbolic way. Yeah, the purpose of the negotiation may be to get to a deal, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there has to be a deal that comes into place. The big issue that I have with people that say, well, you have to get to a deal is like, well, no, why? If you come to a point where that deal doesn't work for you, by definition of the vast majority of negotiation training, you should walk away from that deal or encourage the counterparty to walk away from that deal, depending on your belief structure of how you want to walk away from the deal. We can get into that if you really want to. But I don't feel like every negotiation has to result in a deal. In fact, very often, the best deals are the deals that you don't make, because you may end up pushing yourself into a situation where the deal is not valuable, the deal is super high risk, the deal loses money, the deal is not beneficial to the organization. And I see this all the time with the sales teams that we work with. A salesperson will be super excited. They'll come back with a deal to their VP, and they'll say, hey, I got this deal. VP's super excited because this means that they're going to meet quota. They very quickly skim the surface of that deal, and they sign off. on a deal that may not necessarily make sense. 6 months down the line,
Yeah.
I get a phone call saying, holy cow, we have screwed up. We agreed to something that we shouldn't have agreed to. Please help us get out of this, or help us to negotiate a new deal that is more beneficial for our organization. When in fact that organization, because they were compressed by the timelines that they have, if they had just stopped and thought, okay, is this actually beneficial? They wouldn't have made that deal. In fact, like one of the first examples in the book that I wrote is specifically about this, where the salesperson is super excited. They take the deal to the VP and they say, hey, we can get this deal at full price if we can start the deal in May, and I'm really excited and I want to do this deal. And the VP says, well, hang on. What happens in May in this geographic location that you want to do work? Well, that's when we want to start the deal. Yes, but what happens with the geography? Now, the example is all around earth moving and all that kind of stuff. And they said, well, it rains. Right. So you've committed to something with a 9-month timeline where an entire month is now dead. So now we have to complete it in 8 months. No wonder they said they could do it in full price, because they knew they were able to get you to tie in to something to be complete in 8 months. And so it was a very important lesson around, like, okay, well, maybe this deal isn't actually beneficial. Maybe we're taking on significantly more risk or operational inefficiencies or more cost to do this deal than we should. Now, sometimes you may want to make that decision because, we want to block the competition from coming into our market, or we want to secure this deal to be able to get that logo. But it has to be able to be made with full knowledge of why you're making the deal and the cost of making that deal. And then you have to be comfortable going, okay, are we willing to accept these risks in view of all of these things that we know that we could benefit from? Okay, great. Then let's make that deal. But to a large extent, like, there's great negotiations that take place where the outcome, the result of that negotiation is there's no deal.
Yeah.
And that's wonderful, right? Like, thank God. And sometimes you feel upset about it, right? You feel, nauseous. You're like, I wasn't able to come to a deal. I wasn't able to come to completion. We didn't get something together. Sometimes there's just no deal to be had.
Yeah.
That's okay.
That's okay. Yeah. I agree. I agree with that. And actually, so as you know, my body of work is around emotionally intelligent negotiation. And what I found is in my workshops, there are an increasingly larger number of women who come, because it's not seen as a male dominated kind of pursuit. When you negotiate with emotional intelligence, you need a level of empathy, a level of being able to reflect on yourself and insights. And one of the things that's come up quite recently is, and you mentioned it as well, Mark, is how men and women look at the word no in a negotiation. And I remember in one of your podcasts, you talked about the power of no, and actually, instead of being afraid of no, we should actually welcome no. Like Jim Camp, Jim Camp's book talks about that. So can you unpack that a little bit again? About your experience, about the fear that we have around the word no and how that plays
no
out.
Sucks.
Yeah.
No is like the worst, right? Because you feel like you're getting rejected, and rejection is brutal. Because you probably have some historical trauma associated with being rejected at a very young age. And I'm sure that if, you took enough therapy, as we all should, you could probably remember the first time that you truly felt rejected when someone said no. The unfortunate thing is that if you don't deal with that rejection at some point, you carry that no, that rejection around with you like luggage for the rest of your life. Then when you least want that fear of no to pop its head out of the luggage that you've been carrying for a very long time, that's when it does. And so when you should be asking for more, and then you finally get the courage
Yeah.
to ask for more, and someone says no, immediately you get flooded with all of those same feelings again of rejection that you felt when you had that first experience, and it's terrible. It sucks. And I'm not discounting the 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 trepidation that people feel, or even the emotion that people feel when they get that. It's a real thing.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
really does suck. And here's the shitty part of the side of what I'm trying to convince people of. Even though it sucks, even though it's a terrible feeling, that's unfortunately
Yeah.
part of the process. You are going to get rejected. You are going to hear no. That is a guarantee. There is no way past that. So you have to almost callous yourself and steel yourself to the idea that rejection is forthcoming. You will be rejected. And how are you going to deal with that rejection when it comes?
I love this. I love this. I mean, why I love this so much is because you're getting into beyond the academia. You're getting into the psychology of negotiation. And when you talk about the frameworks that are given to us as children, that still has an effect on how we negotiate today. You know, and most people don't either. They don't want to do the work to recognize, you know, when they first heard no, when they first got rejected, and is that 5-year-old child negotiating now, you know, for a big multi-billion-dollar deal? Is that 5-year-old child still there at the table negotiating? They don't want to do the work, or they just don't even see it, and that's the challenge, right?
For sure.
Because it's and I find trying to have that conversation, that's where the breakthroughs happen. When you explain it the way you've just explained it, like that, and then you start asking some curious questions about your relationship to the word no and rejection, that's when it starts to open up. So I love the way you're looking at this. It's brilliant. I also wanted to touch upon when it comes to genders when they negotiate.
Sure.
It does seem, although it is changing, but it does seem that there are, it's a kind of male-dominated arena at the moment,
For
but
sure.
it is changing. You'll know, well, certainly from your podcast. I mean, what percentage of females did you interview in the world of negotiation, do you think, versus
Very,
men?
very few. There's like a handful. Yeah. There's some amazing women that do
Yeah.
negotiation training, and they are incredible. And many of them have written incredible books. I mean, if you think of Beth Fisher, if you think of Vise Bratby, if you think of Sarah Lashifer and Linda Babcock, and you think of all these amazing, incredible women that have done like groundbreaking work in negotiation, you should read all of their work. But yeah, you're right. There's data that suggests, and it's older data. I'm not sure what
Yeah,
the research
yeah.
looks like today, but there is data suggesting that it is more difficult, right? It is more difficult for women to negotiate. So it's hard. What I would recommend for any woman that's listening to this right now that's like, okay, cool, two dudes talking about how hard it is for women to negotiate, you know, cry me a river, Mark. Let me
Right,
hear it from
right,
someone who's actually done it. Read
right.
that work. Read the work of those women
Yeah,
who have taught negotiation. Read the work of all these incredible women that are sort of doing groundbreaking work.
yeah,
There's like there's incredible work, like Alex Carter, like she's killing
yeah,
it in the negotiation space.
yeah,
So yeah, read their work and find out what their perspective is. Because for me to give you an opinion of why I feel it is, even though I've read the research of why I feel it is the way it is to be just another mouthpiece, right?
yeah,
It's
sure.
far better for you to read their work because at least then you get it from someone who's in a similar perspective to you.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. One at the business school where I teach, one of the professors there of negotiation, his name's Kandat Mehta. He actually did some research on this, some real deep research. I think he wrote a paper on it. He's written a book, And with his students, what he found was that when he asked the women in the group, the graduates, to negotiate their salary, they found it challenging versus the men, they naturally negotiated their salary. But when he asked them to imagine themselves in 10 or 20 years' time, and you're negotiating for that woman in 10 or 20 years' time, so just imagine that person, hands down, the women just wipe the floor with the men in terms of negotiating. And that fed into the research that say when women are negotiating on behalf of someone else, they have so much more success because it's not an ego-driven pursuit.
Mm-hmm. I believe that fully. That makes a lot of sense to me. I find it's easier to negotiate on behalf of someone else almost always. To negotiate on behalf of yourself is a lot more difficult because there's so much more emotion tied into that. So that makes sense to me. That's cool research.
So 446 last count podcast interviews. That's what the last I looked at. I think it was that. I mean, how do you do that? How do you keep that going?
It's all a fabrication. That's not a real number. No, I'm kidding.
No.
446 also includes some throwback episodes that we have in there as well. So to be fair to that number, it's probably closer to 300 and something. But yeah, the goal was to interview as many people in the negotiation space as humanly possible to get very diverse opinions and perspectives about negotiation, to interview my competitors, to interview academics, to interview people that are in conflict resolution. The goal has never been about pursuing the glorification of only ourselves. The goal has been about pursuing the evangelization of good negotiation practices. And that isn't just our stuff. I mean, look, we'd love for you to use our stuff. We want you to use our stuff. But we present a way to negotiate, not the way to negotiate. And I feel like a lot of people get wrapped up in one. It would be like reading one book on marketing and then going, oh, I know everything about marketing. Well, no, right? Like there's a huge amount of information. There's a huge amount of specialisms. There's a huge amount of people that work in different areas. And so I think you need to, like, if you're going to pursue the development of a skill set, you have to read broadly within that skill set, right? So if you want to get better at marketing, you read a ton of different books about marketing. If you want to get better at accounting, you read a ton of different books about how to pursue an accounting career. If you want to get better at negotiation, the same thing should be true. And so if we believe that, then we need to practice that. And so much of what I talk about is like, hey, I present a way to approach this. And by the way, a lot of people disagree with me. That's great. And you should listen to their stuff too. And then make up your own mind about which suits you best. Because ultimately, it comes down to picking and choosing what you find valuable from a bunch of different data sources, and then using that information. It's like only watching CNN or only watching Fox News. Like that's insane. You're going to get only one perspective, and that's crazy. Please don't do that. Read broadly.
Totally agree. And engage with people who have different views, different perspectives than you, and sit with that the cognitive dissonance, right? Of somebody says something completely opposite to what you believe, but sit with that. And I think that's powerful.
Like that happens all the time with my stuff where someone's like, I disagree. And I'm like, great, fantastic. Please tell me why. Right? That's awesome. I love that stuff.
Yeah. We're coming to the end, Mark, and it's a real shame because I could go on for at least another hour. But there are kind of two things kind of spinning around in my head. The first one is I just wanted really just to say it. You don't need to really comment, but for the listeners, that I think you are either 4 or 5 top negotiation guru in the world, right? I think
number 5.
That's number 5. That's an accolade. So you are, whether you like it or not,
close to world domination. Tony.
You're almost there. You're almost there. And the other thing is would it be fair to say that, I mean, I've noticed a slightly more spiritual dint to your posts of late? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean,
absolutely.
what's that about? I really like that.
Yeah, it's just me coming to terms with being more open about what I believe in.
Wonderful.
So I'm just trying to be expressive about what I believe in,
Wonderful.
and trying to say that none of this, none of what I have. If you look at me, the great thing that Steve Harvey says, the guy who runs Family Feud, I'm a big fan. But
Right.
Steve Harvey says, I don't want you to look at me and believe that I did any of this. So that's what I want to say, right? Like, I don't want you to look at me and go, "Ooh, Mark achieved." None of this is my
Yeah.
doing,
Yeah.
and it's my belief, and my very strong belief that it is purely through grace that I have achieved any. If you look at my background
Yeah.
and you look at where I come, there is no chance that this should ever have happened. It is
Yeah.
purely through grace. So that's it. That's what I'm trying to propose, and that's what I'm trying to be more open about.
And I
It's
love that.
gotten landed me in a little bit of hot water, but I think overall it's resonating with folks, and that's
Yeah.
great.
Yeah. I love that. It definitely resonated with me. So, yeah, I wanted to thank you for taking that step. I think it's about time we were able to say exactly what we feel in a way that shouldn't offend people, right? As long as I'm not doing anything, it's my belief, it's my faith, it's nothing
Right.
that I'm not saying it to offend anybody. I exist because of a series of events that happened, of which I had nothing to do with. So
Yes.
what do you put that down to? You can't put it down to me, and so you have to put it down to a higher faith or higher force. And you and I choose to call that God. So that's where we'll wrap up on that. But I want to thank you first, Mark, on for being so gracious. You definitely are somebody I've been following for a long time. I love your podcast. I want you to share if there is anything. What is it that's exciting you at the moment? What are you working on, and how can the listeners find you?
Yeah, what I'm most excited about is our coaching practice that we recently just launched, which we're calling Negotiation Mastery. And people can find it right on the website. If they go to our courses and look under courses, they'll see something called Negotiation Mastery. They can look at that, and I'll give you the URL for that if you want.
Sure.
And yeah, it's just about, the practice of training can sometimes be imposing on your time. You have to dedicate 12 hours over the course of the week to get through some training program. This
Yeah.
is much more consultative, and this is much more shorter, and it's just more accessible, because I want things like this to be more accessible to people. And that's what you're doing with this podcast, right? Making negotiation knowledge accessible to people. And that's great. And I'd like to see more of that. A bunch more.
Mark Raffan, thank you for joining us on Empathy at the Table, and I definitely hope our paths cross again very soon.
Thank you, my friend. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you. Good evening.